At Boise State Public Radio, you can listen to all of our podcasts free of charge. We don't lock any episodes. We don't require subscriptions, nothing like that. But the truth is, although our podcasts are free to listen to, they're not cheap to make. A lot of time and resources go into bringing you the daily news on The Connector, statewide voices on Idaho Matters, and the long-form journalism in podcasts like Scandalized, Extremely American, and Mustang. That's why we're asking, if you can, please consider supporting Boise State Public Radio podcasts today. We have a lot of work planned for 2025. Yes, new podcasts, but none of it would be possible without the generous support of our listeners. Every gift matters, whether it's $5 or $50, whatever feels right to you. Head to our website, boisestatepublicradio.org, and click that blue donate button. If you're giving to support podcasts like the one you just hit play on, leave us a comment with your donation and let us know. Your support will help make sure these podcasts keep coming and remain free and accessible to everyone. Thanks so much for listening.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. Of course, we will get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. And today, our panel includes Christina Lords, the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, and Kyle Fahnensteel, reporter with the Idaho Capital Sun. And we're going to begin today with Christina Lords. Christina, good to have you with us today.
Hey, happy Friday. How's it going?
Good. Happy Friday to you. Happy first Friday of the year, huh?
Yes, we made it. 2025.
I know, right?
Saw that coming.
3 days in and we're doing all right. So, Christina, you spent the morning paying attention to the annual legislative session preview. Now, before we get into all of the details of what was discussed this morning, can you remind us what this event is?
Yes, so this is a wonderful event put on by the Idaho Press Club, and reporters from all over the state can either show up in Boise at the Capitol or submit written questions ahead of time. But it's a really kind thing that the governor and the legislative leadership do so that we can ask some questions going into the legislative session. It's really a chance for reporters to understand what legislative priorities there are, what the governor's budgetary recommendations might be. It's just a good time to get a sense of what's going to go down in the legislation, or the legislative session begins on Monday. So we're headed right into the thick of things for sure.
So who were some of the notable figures at this morning's preview session? You mentioned the governor.
Yes, so the governor speaks for about an hour. He gives a kind of an overview of some of his major priorities, but most of the time is spent answering reporter questions. And then we have a panel of the legislative leadership, including House Speaker Mike Moyle, Senator Lori Den Hartog, Senator Melissa Wintrow, and Representative Steve Birch. And so it's a good mix of Republicans and Democrats, and both chambers, both the House and the Senate, are represented there.
So what were the big topics of discussion this morning, Christina?
It was kind of all over the map, but there are definitely themes that we heard of both from the governor and from the legislators and their priorities. One of the biggest things that I think we'll see for the legislative session, and some of the things that the lawmakers talked about today, was this effort, and now at this point, multi-year effort, to use public funding, public taxpayer dollars for private education. And there have been, at least, within the last 5 years, several proposals that have made it to legislation form. These have gone through the education committees, and it just hasn't in Idaho gained enough traction to fully pass and make it to the governor's desk. So there was talk today about Senator Lori Den Hartog said that she was working on and will support a bill that will provide tax credits for families who want to send students to private schools. So I think there will be at least one bill with that kind of option. That's very similar to what we saw at the beginning of the legislative session in 2024. Last year, that proposal called for a $50 million program that would allow states allow the state of Idaho to dispense tax credits for families to offset things like private or religious education costs, including tuition, transportation, tutoring, those sort of things. But part of the opposition to this idea, and the Democrats talked at length about this, is what sort of accountability will there be for these funds to ensure that they're going toward academic success for these students? What are the outcomes if we are putting public money into private education? How do we know that when private education isn't tracked or held accountable in the same way that K through 12 public schools are? And so Lori Den Hartog did talk about how there will be some oversight in this new proposal. That's one of the things that they've been working on. But when asked, kind of in a follow-up question to that, she said that oversight does not include requirements like standardized testing or requirements related to curriculum or what will be taught. So it's still kind of murky as far as what those parameters are, or what those sideboards are to a proposal like this. So we talked a lot about that. We talked a lot about this idea that Idaho still, among its conservative states, still doesn't have these options for using public dollars for private education. And I think it'll be another battle. I think we'll see how the primary and general election affected those things. We have new legislators. There's a handful of freshman legislators that haven't been able to talk in public hearings and say how they feel about some of this stuff. So we'll see where those votes kind of land on that particular issue.
So with school choice, so you mentioned Lori Den Hartog saying, tax credits. Did any other lawmakers, did the governor say anything more about this and maybe other options?
Yeah, I think we'll see a whole host of proposals. There's actually going to be a 2-hour policy forum and following press conference organized by the Mountain States Policy Center on Monday morning, right before the State of the State address, that will talk about what other states have done, including Arizona. The former governor of Arizona will be at this policy forum and press conference. So I think there's a lot of ideas out there. I think they've been tried before. I think they've run into opposition for various reasons. I think some Republicans want certain things and other Republicans want other things. And certainly the Democrats are, kind of dead set against any proposal that would use public funding for private education. So we'll see. The governor, I think, has always said that he doesn't want to harm the dollars flowing into public education. Public education is a priority for him. It's one of the first things that he always talks about at one of these events. And so I think he's protective of that, but I think he also understands that there's this kind of growing trend among conservative states to try some of these options. But some of these states have also seen real financial hardships or, kind of ballooning of these budgets that they didn't expect. Arizona now pays $800 million for their school choice programs there. I think there is some concern from the governor's office on what does that mean? Where does this money come from? We want school choice. We want parents to have options, but what does that mean when it comes to funding public education, which is, always in a situation where we can always pay teachers more and things like that. So I think it comes down to what are the actual plans? What are the actual, like you're saying, what is the mechanism or the avenue to make these things happen?
Well, and a good point about Arizona, Christina, because all of the research shows that in Arizona, the majority of people who are using that $800 million, not only is it going towards private education, but these are families whose children were already in private schools. So I think this is going to be a battle in the state house this year.
That's exactly the point that Senator Wintrow made, was that there have been studies of how this is played out in other states. And sometimes her point was that sometimes private education is so expensive that a $5,000 tax credit
it won't cover it will not cover tuition.
Right.
at least in private schools in the Treasure Valley. I can tell you that.
Right. And so she's actually done some kind of digging into, because the state doesn't really regulate or monitor private education, it's hard to find some of this information. And so she's said that she started to kind of just call up people and say, well, how much is tuition at your school? And that, some of these tuitions can range like $20,000. And so so the folks that are using this money are already sending their children there. And this is kind of propped up by its supporters as a way to help low-income students afford private education if that's what they choose, if that's what's best for their families. But like you said, research shows that most of the folks that utilize these kind of funds tend to already be in these private schools.
Mm-hmm. Any other topics that of note, Christina?
Oh,
I mean, as
many.
we said, schools, yeah,
So
right?
many.
So many.
We've got, I think that it was clear that the governor's office and the Republican majority part of the legislature is very excited at the prospect of working with the Trump administration in comparison to the Biden administration on things like wildfire response and public lands issues, on Medicaid expansion reform, including following up on waivers that the state of Idaho submitted to the first Trump administration. And House Speaker Mike Moyle said, despite all of Idaho's regulatory reform that it's done in the past 4 or 5 years, especially under Brad Little and his administration, there's a lot more work to be done to get through state code and eliminate bureaucratic red tape. He pointed to how the DOJ Commission under the Trump administration is proposal to kind of go through federal regulations that the state of Idaho has set the standard for finding ways to eliminate some of these old or outdated or particularly cumbersome policies that we still have on the books that really trip up things like small businesses. And Senator Den Hartog talked about how big businesses can afford lawyers to kind of navigate these permitting processes and some of these other bureaucratic things that businesses have to go through to get established, but smaller businesses have a much harder time. And so what can we do to streamline the permitting process and make that more accessible to, smaller families or family-owned businesses and things like that? The other thing that I think will just definitely come up that we've written about is Medicaid expansion reform. And Kyle did ask, my coworker here that's on the call, he did ask, the governor, would you support full Medicaid expansion if the legislature sends a bill like that to your desk? Or would you prefer to kind of reform things and add sideboards? The sideboard is kind of a jargony term that usually means things like requiring people to work to receive Medicaid. I think people on the opposite side of that really say most of the people on Medicaid are working, that they're just in this supposed Medicaid gap where they're working 1 or 2 jobs. They're just not making enough to qualify for those healthcare subsidies through the health exchange. And so, Reclaim Idaho, which is the organization that really led the charge on Medicaid expansion, has sent out many emails calling on Idahoans to get involved in this process, that they're genuinely worried that the legislature will roll back Medicaid expansion and that potentially tens of thousands of Idahoans will lose their health care that voters passed by a very wide majority in 2018 through the ballot initiative. They're Reclaim Idaho and other folks are genuinely worried that these folks might make these decisions at the legislative session and people might not be paying enough attention to that particular issue. There's also a lot that we talked about today about election reform. Speaker Moyle spoke really passionately about some upcoming legislation that he plans to support to offer more transparency to election and campaign finance issues. He talked a lot about how out-of-state money just kind of flooded the zone this primary election and even in the general election, some of which was directly aimed at him. So he has kind of a personal stake in some of this. He basically said that, yes, the First Amendment does protect free speech, but it doesn't protect a person or lobbying group's ability to tell lies during a campaign. So he didn't go into too much detail on what the specifics of that bill will be, but I'm really interested to see what exactly that means. We know Secretary of State Phil McGrain has also said that he plans to propose and pursue some election transparency bills this session. So those are something that every bill that comes out that deals with voting or election reform or ballot initiatives, we're really interested in covering that at the Idaho Capitol Sun. So we'll keep an eye out for those. But the Democrats, on the other hand, spoke today about how fearful they were that there will be legislation that could alter or make it harder for a ballot initiative to qualify. Every time there's been a successful ballot initiative or a referendum that groups are able to put together and put before voters, the very next year, the Idaho legislature has a history of coming back and trying to make it harder for citizens to have that option. If the legislature isn't responding to the needs of the citizenry, our founding fathers put it into our Constitution to say that we can run a ballot initiative, and the Idaho Supreme Court has upheld that. But Democrats are genuinely worried that there will be some types of bills like there has been in the past to try to chip away at the ability for people to run a successful ballot initiative, which is very hard here in Idaho. There's a lot of requirements. It's not easy. There are some states that people might be listening have come from, like California or Colorado, where there's initiatives on every ballot and there's a ton of them, 5 to 10 on every time you go to the ballot box. But that's just not the case here in Idaho because there are those restrictions in place, and groups like Reclaim Idaho are genuinely scared that it might become impossible to run a ballot initiative if they keep tinkering with those policies.
So, Christina, before we go to break, really quickly, how does the average citizen get involved this session? Because they can testify at certain times. So, how does somebody sign up to do that?
Yes. So, the one and only good thing that came out of the COVID pandemic, I feel like, is that the legislature found a way to allow for remote testimony for Idahoans, which is huge because I think people need to understand that in Idaho, there is no kind of grace period or waiting period for when an agenda is posted, and then the legislation is saw before the committee. Sometimes you don't know what's going to be in committee until the night before at 5 p.m. when they post agendas. And then the bill is there, at 8 o'clock in the morning. And it's very hard for Idahoans, especially in northern Idaho or eastern Idaho, to get to Boise, kind of at the drop of the hat. So legislature.idaho.gov is the best place to go to keep up with what's happening every day. That's where you can go get the agendas. From the agenda, you can actually sign up to testify. It does take a little bit to go through that process. The Mountain States Policy Center actually put out a really good column that we're going to run on Tuesday about how different states allow remote testimony far easier and have that kind of window of a 3-day grace period of here's when the public hearing will be held for some of these things so that more people can participate in this process. And so yeah, you can sign up for remote testimony at this point. I think there's a lot of things to really take seriously and get involved with this legislative session with some of these issues that we've already talked about and others. So I think it's just really important that Idahoans understand that they can have a voice, they can show up to these public hearings, and they can tell legislators how they feel about their proposals.
So, Kyle, the ACLU of Idaho filed an emergency motion December 23rd, citing that mass resignations at the state public defender office have left countless defendants without proper legal representation. So before we get into the details of this motion, can you first talk about this new state office of public defenders? Can you just remind folks why we went from a county system to a new state system?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Gemma. So I guess this goes back to 2015. This lawsuit that ACLU just filed a new emergency motion for, it actually filed it back in 2015, alleging that Idaho's public defense system violated low-income people's right to legal counsel, guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution. Then in 2023, Idaho lawmakers passed a new law creating this new Office of the State Public Defender. That effectively shifted public defense from being run by Idaho's 44 counties to one state agency. And that's where we are right now.
Okay, so this change happened October 1, Kyle. And to say it was not a smooth transition is a bit of an understatement. In fact, we know that public defenders didn't even have telephones in Ada County when this switch happened. So what has the new state public defender said about this transition?
Yeah, so there's a ton of reporting about how this has been kind of a rocky start for the new agency. My colleague Mia Maldonado has done a ton of work on this. And I guess the long and short of it is that some public defenders have quit, setting new pay cuts under the new system, and a slew of other things have happened too. But
Mm-hmm.
the Public Defense Office, just to be clear, they didn't initially reply to the lawsuit news yesterday. Idaho hasn't formally replied to the new emergency motion in court. But agency officials in the past have said that the transition is pretty complicated and it's still under
Mm-hmm.
improvement. And they've acknowledged some of the problems with the transition, but they've defended some of the office's work and provided more context on how the pay cuts. Well, actually, they say that most public defenders actually saw a pay raise.
Hmm. Okay, I'll get back to that in a minute. But what I do want to talk about next, Kyle, is can you give us some examples of why the ACLU decided to file this motion? Because my understanding is, and according to your reporting, that some folks are saying they did not have legal representation in court when this transition happened.
Yeah, ACLU's new update to their lawsuit says that countless of Idahoans have gone weeks, if not longer, trying to even contact their attorneys. Some of them are in custody. Some of them couldn't get any representation in legal hearings, and they provide like several examples. They have written statements, or they cite statements and court proceedings, and they also talked to attorneys and clients who were determined legally indigent, which is the process you use to be appointed public defense counsel. And I guess I'll just run through some of the examples here.
Mm-hmm.
One day in Kootenai County, the lawsuit says that no defendants in 17 misdemeanor arraignments had legal counsel. One defendant up there in North Idaho said they showed up to court 3 times without their attorney, even though they said they had called the state public defense office every other day since early on in their case. Another defendant said he drove 8 hours from Boise to Bonner County 3 times over 2 months, only for their proceedings to be rescheduled because state public defenders withdrew from his case. And then on attorney turnover, they present some data that I hadn't seen before. They say about a quarter of Ada County's institutional office attorneys have resigned since mid-August, and they say at least some of them left because of the new pay cuts. Kootenai County's public defense office now has half the number of public defenders it needs. Canyon County's office is down by almost a third what it had before the transition. So there's a lot to go through.
Well, right. And Kyle, talking about one of the main complaints in the motion, which are these mass resignations, and many former public defenders cited major pay cuts as to why they resigned. And I know there's been some pushback about that from the new state public defender saying, well, most people got raises. Well, I mean, there is a handful of public defenders in Ada County who left, who had been public defenders with Ada County for more than 20 years, who were getting upwards of $20,000-$30,000 pay cuts. And so that's not necessarily sustainable because public defenders don't make a lot, they're not making what private attorneys make, right? So this is part of the ACLU's complaint. It is this how these mass resignations have now impacted indigent defendants because, as you just said in your reporting, they're not showing up for their clients. With that said, Kyle, I mean, this is a complicated system, but what is the ACLU wanting, I believe, the Supreme Court to do now? Because this is just a highly complicated transition, and people who are supposed to be getting legal representation are not getting the kind of representation that I think the hope was when this changeover happened.
Yeah, so ACLU is asking the Idaho Supreme Court to step in some pretty big ways. One big one, they're asking the Supreme Court to order Idaho to release from custody legally indigent people who either haven't talked to attorneys within 7 days of being appointed one, or if their attorneys haven't represented them at hearings. But they also have some other requests too. They asked the Supreme Court to rule that Idaho must create and implement a plan to fix the public defense system. They also asked the Supreme Court to order regular reports from the new state public defender's office. And they asked the court to toss the lawsuit back to a lower Idaho court to appoint an independent monitor to watch over Idaho's progress on its improvement plan. So they asked for the court to step up in quite a few big ways.
So, Kyle, with all of these asks, what's next? Where are we then in this with this motion having been filed December 23rd?
So attorneys with the state of Idaho this week filed an illegal filing, asked the court for more time to be able to respond to their complaint. So it still may be a little while till we see what happens on the litigation front. I don't know the timeline for all the proceedings and for the Supreme Court to potentially set hearings. But then we're also at this big time of the year where the State of the State is happening on Monday, and legislative leaders and the governor talked to reporters about that today, but they didn't really release that much information about what's going to be in the state budget and what the fine details of the legislative session are going to look like. So I still think it may be at least a little while until we understand what happens both on the political front and in terms of legislative or policy fixes to address this issue, and also on the court front, what the court might do and how things might shake out there.
And you bring up a good point, Kyle, with the legislative session beginning on Monday. And I know this was not in your reporting, so I don't want to put you on the spot because I'm sure you don't have the number right there in front of you. But we do know that the new state public defender will, just like any other state office, now have to go in front of the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee, JFAC, and try to get a budget approved. And we do know that he will be asking for significantly more money because, Kyle, it seems that maybe part of the issue is that this new system has just been underfunded when it started in October.
Yeah, the ACLU complaint does allege that that the office is struggling to maintain several services because it didn't receive adequate funding. And the state public defender's office has said in the past that it expects to introduce to ask for more money this legislative session. I don't know the specifics of what those proposals will look like. And the legislature has shifted their budget dynamic to where they approve kind of the agency's base budget first and its maintenance budget request, and then they approve new items later on. So I still think it could be a little while until we see the full picture.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, appreciate that reporting. I want to thank both Christina and Kyle with the Idaho Capital Sun for joining us today. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.